Good morning. I'm Art Delacruz, the President and Chief Operating Officer here at Team Rubicon. And I want to say thanks to all of you for joining us today. As we know, part of being ready for this year is taking a look in the rearview mirror and seeing the amazing journey the organization has had as we approach the hurricane season. And I want you to let you know, first of all, as supporters of Team Rubicon, as supporters of the men and women who make a difference after natural disasters strike, you are important, and I hope you'll take ownership in the accomplishments that these amazing men and women have had in the field across 2020, and also take ownership as the story unfolds in 2021 of the amazing work that I'm certain that these men and women will do as we move forward. So obviously, last year was an amazing, record-breaking year. 30 named storms, which broke the record set in 2005. 12 of those made landfall, which broke a record set in 1915 of 9. So obviously a significant hurricane season, and all of this against a backdrop of a pandemic that made every operation a little more difficult, made ensuring the safety of the volunteers a little more made ensuring that we weren't introducing, the virus to the communities we were serving a little more difficult, but we were able to accomplish the mission thanks to you. So what we'd like to do today is take a brief look at 2021 as it's about to unroll in front of us. The Pacific hurricane season actually started May 15th. A couple of days ago, the Atlantic hurricane season started on June 1st. We saw earlier through some of the rains and the torrential downpours that were experienced in Louisiana again, that the hurricane season in some form or fashion has already arrived. So what we'd like to do for today is, just prep you on some of the things that we can expect, as we move forward. One of the things that we saw last year that's unique about the hurricane seasons is oftentimes these storms, these low attention disasters, as we call them, don't necessarily make the news. It could be the hurricane traveling inland and dumping rain in some mountainous area in South Carolina that's going to actually drift and flood a city days later. It could be, the storm as it tracks, with 30 of them again, or maybe it's in the Rio Grande Valley. An early storm wouldn't necessarily indicate the severity, but nonetheless, there are homeowners and there are people that are impacted by disaster. Their homes are flooded, trees are knocked down, all of these different things. So understand that low attention disasters are always going to be part of our mission, because again, being on television isn't the indicator that it's time for Team Rubicon to respond. It's men and women who are experiencing, their worst day because of a natural disaster, that we have to answer the call to give them hope through the delivery of our services, the actions that our men and women take to make sure that is ready to go. We've been on the field practicing, we are ready to respond. And I wanted to give you a little bit of, kind of how we started this training. We gathered our men and women, our volunteers, our gray shirts early, in the year, and even in through the end of the last year. We watched the predictions from NOAA that Lauren Vadier will talk about here shortly. It's going to be another storm season. With that against the backdrop, we understood that we have to do a lot of training to make sure that we're ready for what's going to be an above anticipated storm season. So we started to aggressively train. We made sure that the people, the process, the technology was ready and positioned in a manner where we could deliver our services as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible, and with the safety, again, of our volunteers and our deployers front and center. We also had to do this against a backdrop of COVID. We have to be able to operate in the COVID environment, and thankfully, with the vaccinations continuing across the country, we're finding volunteers that are fully immunized. We're going into communities where many of the people we're serving are fully immunized, and that makes it much easier. But we're still treating every operation as a COVID operation, where we have to take these mitigating steps to ensure, again, that we keep ourselves safe, we ensure that we keep the communities we're serving safe, and we ensure that the communities that our volunteers return to are safe. So again, that takes a mindset that, again, we learned in 2020 when we deployed over 20,000 volunteers across the country and had a minimal number of actually single-digit cases of COVID through those operations. So again, COVID will continue to be an important backdrop. Finally, we're conducting exercises. We're running through the plays, be it marketing, be it operations, mobilization, every component of the organization that's required to create that strong chain, that link of events and process has been tested so we can ensure that we're serving people in that moment of need. So as we position, we expect these hurricanes to track. One of the unique things about these types of storms is you have some understanding of where they could go, but as we've seen over the past couple of years, you never understand the severity. You never understand how the storms will grow, and you can't, direct where that impact is going to happen. But we have spent, a fair amount of time understanding, in particular in the Southeast, what is likely to happen. So we have volunteers that are positioned, across the Southeast that are ready to respond. We have equipment and things like chainsaws and heavy equipment at the ready to be prepared to deploy. And those people have been augmented by our volunteer base that has grown to over 150,000 ready to deploy at a moment's notice to help people in need as we approach the season. So a lot has been going into this. I thank you for making the investment in Team Rubicon. Some of the men and women that are on the sidelines right now, ready to get into the game, have been with us since the very beginning, since 2011. Maybe you made a donation in 2012 that has turned that person into instructor. That instructor might have trained 15 other people on how to use a chainsaw. And we continue to build this standing volunteer army of gray shirts, again, that can deliver services at a moment's notice in the places that are required. I'm going to step back a little bit here, and I'd love to introduce Lauren. She's going to provide a quick situation update as well as an outlook for what we can expect in 2021, and then I'll come back to close this out. Thank you again for being here. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Art. I'm going to share screen, and we will talk through some of the themes that Art really touched on a little bit more in depth. So, talking through the 2020 hurricane season, it was the most active on record. In addition, we saw 14 hurricanes and 7 major hurricanes, major meaning they had winds above 110 miles per hour. And of those, there were 9 tropical cyclones that struck the Gulf Coast throughout the season. Not only did we see some unique situations, such as, multiple storms rapidly intensifying right before landfall, but there were multiple occasions with storms making landfall in similar areas. So, looking at Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta in Louisiana, it was about 15-mile difference between where that landfall was. So what that really means is the same people and those same homes were impacted multiple times throughout the season. The economic losses from last year's hurricanes is estimated to have caused more than $37 billion. And although that's a ton, it's actually the 8th costliest hurricane season on record. So 6 of those 7 more costly hurricane seasons occurred over the prior 15 years. And what that really means is that threat and that high impact of these storms, it's a trend we're just going to continue to see more frequently. And of that $37 billion in hurricane season last year, that's not factoring in other storms, such as the Easter Day tornadoes that impacted Gulf Coast states and additional states as well as the pandemic, which, laid this new burden on resources, on public servants that are exhausted. But most importantly, it's made historically less vulnerable communities more vulnerable and higher vulnerable communities at even greater risk. So, looking ahead, a few weeks ago, NOAA did release their 2021 hurricane outlook. I'm just going to play this video, but, briefly talk over it. The Atlantic hurricane season, has officially begun, and on paper, goes through November 30th. While NOAA does not anticipate the historic level of activity that was seen last year, they're still projecting an above average hurricane season. And I'll pause it, just there. So the possibility of 20 named storms, 5 major hurricanes, 10 hurricanes. So, this is still not good news, even though they're projecting it might not be as bad as last year. So where these storms may land, those projections are just not known. We know the Gulf Coast was really battered this last year, and we just don't know what this future, this season will look like. So regardless of the number of storms, it really can only take one powerful storm to be destructive and really cause impacts to a lot of people. For those not too familiar with the specifics, the category of a hurricane, which goes from 1 to 5, 5 being the strongest, is determined by wind speeds, and rain or size is not a consideration in that categorization. So what that means is it doesn't need to be a major hurricane to be a major threat that could cause catastrophic damage. If it's a storm with a large physical size, if there's lots of rain, if it's moving slow, that can cause significant destruction. For reference, by the time Hurricane Sandy made landfall in New Jersey in 2012, NOAA determined it was no longer considered a hurricane, though hurricane force winds, did impact land before landfall. So that's still the 5th costliest hurricane that we've seen, with a major percentage of that damage occurring in the Northeast when it had already lost its hurricane trait. So it's something we don't want to get too focused on, just because we know that strength of a storm with those wind speeds is not the only threat that it can really bring. So just touching on, what we're currently looking at. We saw earlier this year Winter Storm Uri bringing severe weather and through a lot of the southern states, causing those impacts, causing billions of dollars of damage to homeowners. And then we've seen this excessive rain over the last few weeks, particularly in Louisiana and Texas, and which has flooded homes. TR is actively mucking out homes in East Baton Rouge Parish from those storms. And communities like Lake Charles in Louisiana, which we served last year, received more rain over the last few weeks than during last year's hurricane season combined. So these are some of the same communities that were impacted during last year's hurricane season that are being impacted right now and are now at high risk of being impacted by more hurricanes in the future. What we're just looking at here is a projected rainfall over the next 24 hours. So it's still going to continue. So just want to jump briefly back and just touch on last year and what TR did, and then dive into communities and zones we serve. So last year's hurricane season brought more wind-based impacts, and TR removed vegetative debris to about 700 homes, tarped 260 roofs, and mucked out almost 100 homes. These, that's some of the information our volunteers in the field collect so that we can efficiently manage our work orders of homeowner information. And what this is looking at is those dots are homes that we worked on related to hurricanes. It's layered over SVI. We'll touch on that in a second. And so kind of in addition to this impact data and collecting that homeowner information to help process their assistance, it also, collecting this information helps us more accurately measure the impact of our volunteer efforts and be transparent with donor funds and the impact on the community. So through numerous partnerships, our volunteers are really able to capture this data in the field using a custom-built mobile platform, and they feed it back to operational leaders on the ground, enabling daily planning and allowing us to assess and analyze impact, really across the organization. So, last year we did respond to those 5 hurricanes domestically, which we can kind of see on this map where those locations were. But in total, since 2010, we've responded to 29 different hurricanes, and that's across 16 different states, U.S. territories, as well as 6 different countries. So we've built a lot of these relationships during those responses, and we'll continue to leverage them, as well as focus on building new ones, to really ensure we are targeting the communities most in need in the future. One of the layers here I just touched on, the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. We've talked about it many times before, so hopefully it's sounding familiar. But it uses 15 U.S. Census variables on societal factors such as socioeconomic status, household composition, race, ethnicity, language, and housing, transportation. We can use this as a baseline to determine, really where to deploy our resources once a storm does occur and impacts happen. Anything over 0.5 is considered more vulnerable than average, and 0.75 is highly vulnerable. So in response to hurricanes in 2020, TR worked on almost 960 homes, 75% of which were among the most vulnerable populations affected. So it's worth also restating that SVI is just one of the factors in assessing their vulnerability. And even just to zoom in to see where our focus efforts were last year, even getting down to kind of the census tract level, you can see that vulnerability. This is the Lake Charles area of how it helped us, kind of just target zones in most need. So this is a very helpful tool, and we recognize it doesn't tell the whole story of a community's vulnerability or resilience. But a closer look might reveal, the SVI may be skewed low a little bit. So we'll look at other factors such as, infrastructure or food insecurity, which can help just paint a more complete picture of the vulnerable populations, thus helping us better deploy our resources. So COVID has really exacerbated a lot of these vulnerabilities as well, which really aren't reflected in some of this information. So even just looking at vaccinations that have been initiated in the U.S. to date, while more than half of adults in the U.S. are now fully vaccinated against COVID-19, there is significant variation among regions and states. And vaccination rates in the South and some more remote rural communities are lagging behind the averages across the U.S. So there is some concern that in these communities, especially as they prepare for another hurricane season, along with the typical slate of disasters that they see, that, there's just a lot of stressors exacerbating this vulnerability. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama have among the lowest vaccination rates in the country, around 30%. And finally, just kind of narrowing in on some of those communities, we look here, this is kind of looking at a relationship between the social vulnerability index and natural hazards as a whole. And just to even narrow it down, kind of looking at those more vulnerable communities, this will narrow it down. So this is looking at those above that 0.5 threshold. But what are the communities that have, high, medium to high risk of hurricanes? This is those communities. This is pointing out those communities that are at greatest risk of facing a hurricane threat and at high vulnerability. So we can see how many communities, and it's not just along the coast that we have to be concerned about. So, these communities are less likely to recover when they're faced with those stresses. So it's really understanding who they are. It's just really important to us because it's something that we can proactively engage to, as we lean into hurricane season. So looking at this information, just helps us really be familiar with kind of the landscape and what's the potential for this hurricane season, and to get ahead and start shaking those hands of those communities to ensure when they do need assistance, they know that we're here to come support them. Finally, I know I touched on some high-level TR impact data in this on how TR has previously supported those impacted by hurricanes over the last 11 hurricane seasons. So I just wanted to wrap up with acknowledging kind of the qualitative impact in that data by just thanking the thousands of volunteers, that really have put their blood, sweat, and tears into serving those communities in need. And to the donors who, despite, this ever-growing lack of attention on disasters and hurricanes, we really saw that last year, but we've been seeing it, that low attention, less focus over the last few years. So really just appreciate, that supporting those marginalized communities in need by helping enable our volunteers to serve. And with that, I'll throw it back to you, Art.
Thanks, Lauren. As you probably saw from Lauren's incredible explanation, it takes, it's science. The science behind delivery of services is really important. How do you identify the communities most in need? How do you identify, as you saw in her last slide, the communities that are likely, to be in need? So you can prepare ahead of time because, in the end, the hope as we begin to plan is that, we'll get to a position where we, as, gray shirts, look at ourselves and say, we're glad we did, and that gets to preparation and it gets to training and it gets to being ready instead of what we often see, which is, I wish I had. On that note as well, for those of you that are, watching today, I'd encourage each of you to take an assessment as we enter this hurricane season of your own personal preparation, regardless of where you are. Again, preparedness is everything. And part of that also includes taking the steps as necessary and as able and as available to be ready for COVID, to be ready for a storm or natural disaster of what type it might that could impact your community. And in doing so, in that preparation, you will also find yourself better able to serve your neighbors in a time of need, as we are certain to see in 2021. So again, to reiterate a couple of the key points, from today. Number one is thank you. It takes investment and vision to make things happen. One of the things Lauren showed you was a lot of different technology. That technology was actually, created in points of need as a generous donations that allowed us to work with technology partners, and it allowed us to bring the right resources in, be able to develop and communicate a more granular picture of what is happening, be it COVID, be it social vulnerability index, be it availability of volunteers. All of that happens again because we can tie it back to, the dollar that you donated as you trusted Team Rubicon. So I'd ask again that you take ownership of our tools and the accomplishments that we'll have in the future, because again, you made it happen. You're allowing us to maximize impact in the field. We have to be able to serve as many people and the right people as possible, while again ensuring that we keep our volunteers safe. I'd be remiss if I didn't, remind everyone that COVID continues to impact communities. We saw areas where the vaccination rate is low, and that complicates and exacerbates the picture as we deliver services. So again, part of personal resilience will be continuing our efforts towards COVID vaccination distribution. I'm incredibly proud to say that our men and women gray shirts, along with the Veteran Coalition for Vaccination, which is a grouping of another 6 veteran service organizations, have reached over 1.6 million vaccinations distributed, and we continue those operations across the country, in addition to the 105 cities we've already served this year. Finally, I'll finish out by saying, thank you for your belief and trust in Team Rubicon. I would offer that, we are available for any questions you might have. In each of your questions, there is incredible opportunity. So we'd love to understand your observations. We'd love, to learn through the things that you're questioning to ensure that we can communicate properly to you as you, again, take ownership of the incredible impact that will occur in 2021. The hurricane season is here. 2021 will prove again to be an active season. I hope you know that through your generosity, our men and women, these gray shirts, the people who are going to, give up their personal time to grab a shovel or to fill a sandbag or to, rip wet drywall, off a house that's been flooded, they are at the ready with an understanding that through Team Rubicon, they can reconnect with community, identity, purpose, other veterans, and most importantly, know that they are part of the solution in having neighbors serving neighbors. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you again for your donation, and special thanks to Lauren for that great explanation of what we can expect in 2021. Take care, everyone. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you again for believing and supporting in Team Rubicon's mission.